Welcome to the Affirming Village podcast, where we center neurodivergent voices, affirm diverse ways of being, and empower families, educators, and advocates with knowledge that truly honors the whole learner. We're your co-hosts, Dr. Destiny Huff, a late diagnosed autistic ADHD mental health therapist and non-attorney special education advocate, and Lisa Baskin Wright, an ADHD and dyslexic educator and IEP coach. Together, we dig into conversations about neuroaffirming practices, special education, and disability rights. Please remember, nothing shared on this podcast is medical or legal advice, and the views shared here by the host and the guest are their personal opinions. This space is for educational purposes only, to help you feel informed, empowered, and never alone in the village. Okay, so welcome back. This is part 2 on self-advocacy. So episode 9, we talked about self-advocacy, and because Lisa and I like to fly by the seat of our pants, as we were doing it and wrapping up, we were like, no, we did not cover all the pieces, and we want to do a part 2. And since it's our podcast, we do what we want. So for part 2, we really want to get into the social side of self-advocacy and, what that can look like. And then we want to wrap up part 2 with really diving into how do parents, educators, administrators, related service providers, how educators, how do we all honor neurodivergent and disability self-advocacy, and how do we support that in those different settings? So Lisa?
Yeah, so as we were wrapping up the last episode, I was just starting to tap into what self-advocacy looks like in terms of like social relationships. And, what I was kind of thinking about was sort of earlier in that episode, we had talked about self-advocacy in terms of like asking for help. And thinking about self-advocacy in some of those like more concrete type ways, asking for help, asking for a break, choosing a coping strategy or a regulation strategy, those kinds of things. And I think what was missing, at least in depth in that conversation that I'm hoping we can dive into a bit more today, is what does self-advocacy look like in more nuanced ways, in particular in the context of friendship and relationships with peers. And, one of the things that I find is that those are trickier spaces for neurodivergent and disabled learners to navigate. Mm-hmm. And so they might become really adept at or build skills around, recognizing when they need some help, or coming up with a tool to, alert somebody or communicate with someone that they need a break, and then learn what works for them during a break, right? All of that too. Like sometimes they can recognize they need a break, but they're not quite sure what to do during the break.
Right.
But the piece in friendship is tricky.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's tricky for a number of reasons. First of all, you're talking about two learners, right? Two children. And so, adults, one hopes, like, right, their brains are more fully developed and they can kind of ebb and flow and navigate those situations a little bit differently than perhaps a peer. But you know what? I'm actually going to pull it up on my phone as we speak. I don't know if you saw this. I ended up sharing it in my stories yesterday. That Audie Analyst put out an incredibly powerful post about like social skills in terms of like the social, the first slide says the hidden cost of teaching social and relationship skills. And she goes on to talk about, she's an autistic Indigenous woman, 44 years old, works as a behavior analyst. And so some of the sort of expectation as somebody in that role is to help autistic learners navigate the social space. And how complicated that is as a neurodivergent adult who is Indigenous, and sort of those cultural differences and how neurotypical norms sort of frame that conversation, how these ideas of like politeness and right, you know, that more direct communication isn't perceived as being polite. And we touched on that a little bit last time. But one of the other things that she talked about, this post was so good. I'm not going to read like the whole thing, but just a couple of things that like one of the slides says, we teach children that friendship is built on loyalty, honesty, advocacy, standing up for each other, and direct communication when harm happens. And then the next slide is, what's the unspoken reality? And this idea of reciprocation and how it's actually rare. And that, you know, from her perspective, like, the loyalty autistic people offer in friendships is rarely reciprocated. That's a quote from her slide. You know, another quote is, society prefers politeness over truth, comfort over accountability, conflict avoidance over relational repair. Autistic people are often handed two sets of directions that can contradict one another, and then they're blamed when they follow the wrong sort of rule at the wrong time. Anyway, I can't recommend the post enough, but it really just got me thinking about the complexity of friendship and sort of what friendship can mean or how it's conceptualized for autistic humans, for neurodivergent humans, for neurotypical humans, how societal pressures come into play, this idea of politeness and how it's really kind of, I don't want to say in direct contrast, but there's conflict there, there's friction there between politeness and self-advocacy. And that can be really hard. I don't know. It just got my wheels turning. It was such a powerful post and a really important thing to think about, because friendships for anyone can be really tricky and hard to navigate, and finding folks that you feel comfortable with and in alignment with. And is that around a shared interest? Is it right? And what does that look like over the lifespan? And when conflict happens, and we want there to be repair, you know, I remember having this conversation with a neuropsych many years ago, where they were talking about this idea of sort of self-advocacy, or like setting boundaries or giving feedback in the context of friendship, that in some ways that's a real gift that you can give to somebody, is that you care enough about them to say, this is what I need in this relationship.
Yeah.
And that can be really hard, especially if you are a people pleaser and you really don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, that you'd rather swallow your own vinegar and your own pain. But that it does really then start to chip away at the friendship because you don't feel like you can be your authentic self. So I just said a whole mouthful, but I want to get your thoughts. I see you nodding along.
No, because I think what you're talking about, no, it's very valid. And I think anyone that is an autistic adult can 100% connect to that directness having at some point impacted a friendship or ended a friendship. And I like to take it, you know, just thinking about that range, right, from pre-K to 12th. And like, you can see that early on when in preschool, like, do you want to share? No, I don't want to share. Like, do you want to play this with me? No, I don't want to play. I don't like dinosaurs. I don't like talking about Barbie. I don't like, right? Like, that can start out very early and it's like one of the things that societally that we do is we go, well, you want to have friends, right? You want to make friends, right?
Yeah.
Right. And everyone at some point, that is probably as an adult come out of your mouth to a child because you genuinely want them to have friends and make friends, but you don't realize that you are triggering a mask.
Yeah.
You are teaching them that their authentic selves is not going to build a friendship.
Right.
And so I think that it goes from there on to when we're like, oh, you don't say that you don't like that, or you don't want to do that, or you don't, right? And then we get into, oh, so now I've made this a black or white rule where I must comply because you're saying I don't say don't do that, even though I don't want to. So, but that speaks to the nuance.
My favorite word.
If you haven't heard, this is the running theme where I say nuance is Lisa's word. But no, it speaks to the nuance of when working with neurodivergent learners, and in particular, in this instance, I'm thinking about autistic learners and how our thinking can be very black or white. And if you're like, no, you don't do this, you do this. How, when that is generalized, we apply that generally. And so it doesn't speak to specific situations, it goes across the board. And so, circling that back to the social aspect of self-advocacy, part of self-advocacy can be in those social dynamics and things, saying like, no, I don't want to do what all 5 of my friends are doing. I want to do this. I don't want to play tag. I'd rather be on the swings. I don't want to do cheerleading. I would rather do chess club. It's like it can translate into those things. And so one of the things that came to mind when you were talking about that just like I was laughing inside. My oldest son and his best friend are both autistic. They met on a military base, so both of them moved. And so now we do video calls. And the funniest thing is that I've heard this conversation before and then seen the after, where my son will just come and and I'm just gonna say a name. This is not his best friend's name, but he'll be like, Jason and I decided that we were done, so he said, okay, that's all, I'm done. And I was like, okay, and they got off the call.
Love it.
And it's so authentic because like that's literally how it operates. Or like they were in the middle of a call and I'd forgot to tell dad they were going to be on a call, and dad brings the food and my son is hungry. So he literally goes, he's like, okay, you talk to my brother about his 5 favorite things. I'm going to go get some food. And he just leaves the screen and he goes to get the food. And I'm like, buddy, are you still doing your call? And he's like, yeah, but I told him to talk to my brother while I go grab some food really quick because I'm hungry. And he said, okay, so they're talking and I'm getting food. And I'm like, okay, but that's not like, you don't continue to do, because this call, he wants to talk to you, not your brother. And so he's like, oh, okay. Oh, yeah. So I'll just like grab something and go back up there. But because they're both autistic, they have this authenticity with each other. The other side of that I've seen too is when they were first building that friendship and I really didn't know his best friend. He came home very upset one day. And what had happened was his best friend had told him something in confidence, and he then told someone else. And his best friend was like, why would you do that? I literally told you not to tell anyone. And so my son was kind of learning a little bit of social dynamics and politics, right? Because somebody had asked something. It had a similar topic to what the best friend had told him, and he told him. And so the best friend was like, I'm done. We're not friends anymore. And he was like very distraught over it. And it dysregulated him for the remainder of his school day. And when we talked about it and we talked through it and I helped him see, and I was able to give him an example of like, what if you told your brother, da, 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 and he comes into, I'm like, we've talked about like certain things. It's okay if you don't tell other people now, if there's, it's going to hurt themselves or someone else, but he trusted you with that information. And so the next day he went in and he apologized and he was like, okay, thank you. Like, don't do that again. And then that was all she wrote. And they've been best friends ever since. But it was that piece of navigating those dynamics. And then when I talked to mom later, because we became friends through our kids becoming friends. She's like, oh, I remember that. Like, she was like, because my son was also dysregulated because he was, very hurt by like him telling. And she had explained to him, like, buddy, that's because it wasn't something like she said that like we would perceive as like you can share that with someone. But he literally said, don't. And then he did. And so that's what we mean when we talk about like the social piece and navigating those social norms, navigating those social dynamics. And then like that's advocating for yourself. And I always say, I've noticed a lot of neurodivergent girls, in my opinion, female born individuals, they tend to pick up on social cues quicker than male presenting autistics or male-born autistics. I'm sorry if I'm getting like the gender language mixed up. I'm trying to say it correctly, and I've noticed that in the sense of a lot of times for autistic males, in my experience as a parent, professional, and autistic, a lot of the things that they like at certain ages are considered socially acceptable, right? So trains, sports, Pokemon, anime, even if they're called a nerd, quote unquote, like my husband said, he gets really irritated now that anime is a whole thing. And he's like, I remember when you weren't cool for like an anime, but whatever.
Whatever.
He's like, but okay. But like those things are more socially acceptable, right? Versus with what I've noticed with females is that when you're looking at that, like if it's not, let's say Barbies, or right now I think the big thing is K-pop Demon Hunters, like if it's not certain things that like, Disney princesses, then you're othered. And then the other side of that advocacy piece is that then when if that's your special interest in particular, and that is your hyperfixation and your focus, and then they're wanting to do other things or they've moved past that because that's where you are, you self-advocate and you're like, no, I still want to do this, talk about this, sing about this, watch this, play with this. And they're like, no. And so now there's that being ostracized because you self-advocated for yourself.
Yeah, that's really tricky. I have a couple of thoughts jumping to mind of like conversations that I thought were really powerful on this topic. One of them was, and they made it into a podcast, Learn, Play, Thrive. I'm like all of a sudden totally brain fart. Learn, Play, Thrive has a course out from Rachel Dorsey and VTC about like quote unquote teaching social skills to autistic and neurodivergent humans, kids. And as the course was launching, they did like a Facebook Live or whatever that they then turned into an episode of Two Sides of the Spectrum, which is the podcast through Learn, Play, Thrive. And it was really, really fascinating to hear these two autistic adults talk about kind of social skills and what that looks like for autistic and neurodivergent learners in school. And one of the things that VTC was saying, and they're just freaking amazing. So they're both speech language pathologists. Rachel was diagnosed as a child and was in special education, throughout public education. And V is a late diagnosed autistic adult. And when they began working as a speech language pathologist, they did not have their autism diagnosis. And so their schooling sort of painted this picture of autistic individuals in a very sort of deficits focused light. And so they didn't identify themselves as autistic, given the framework that they were sort of provided in their own schooling. But as they began working with autistic and neurodivergent learners, we're like, this feels familiar. But one of the things that they were saying that I thought was really, really interesting was, and we touched on this a little bit in the last episode, is sort of the over pathologizing and over analyzing that happens of neurodivergent and autistic learners. That if they're either not diagnosed or not identified yet, or non-disabled or neurotypical peers were doing kind of the same thing, we wouldn't assign, I don't know, like a temperature to it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But if it's an autistic human, then all of a sudden, like, it's a problem that's supposed to be fixed.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think that one of the examples that V gave, um, this was from like a year and a half ago, just to give myself a little grace for not remembering every single detail. But one of the examples was that, like, learners who, say at lunch or recess, choose to read a book and just kind of
Mm-hmm.
decompress and take a moment. Um, that, if that student has not been identified as autistic, they're like, oh yeah, Lisa just likes to read. That's what she does at recess. Sometimes she's doing her thing. Whereas if Lisa's been identified as autistic and has an IEP, then all of a sudden it's a problem that Lisa is reading at recess and she's isolating herself and we have to fix it and we have to, right? And so
100%.
right. And so I find with some of the families that I'm supporting in the IEP process is like, how are we honoring that? Like, as we're sort of writing, say, social communication goals or peer relationship type goals, where is the agency and the self-determination and the self-advocacy piece for the learner? Is like, if they don't want to hang out at recess because they're like, I need a minute, thank you so much. Like, how are we making sure that we're not forcing them into a social situation when they're like, their spoon jar may be empty and they need to refill their cup, right? Like, I had a parent describe this, the parent of a PDA, or talk about their autonomy bucket. How are we filling their autonomy bucket throughout the day? Because we know that school has all these inherent things to it that are going to empty the bucket,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think
Mm-hmm.
we could think of it, similarly in terms of, like, taking a moment to regulate yourself or whatever, like, is fine, and we shouldn't be over pathologizing it. And
Mm-hmm.
because more than one thing could be true at the same time, that it can be a really isolating experience. And, you know, I don't think it's an uncommon experience that initiating social connection can be really hard for autistic individuals. How do I enter this conversation? How do I invite myself into this play? Um, and so, yes, I want to honor that you might need some time alone, or to just be in the sandbox and getting your hands in that sand and getting that input. Um, but you might be doing that because it's filling one need, and you also at the same time might be having an experience of feeling left out or isolated, or of longing, wishing that you were able to join, a game that's happening adjacent that also looks appealing.
100%. And when you talk about that too, that gets into that aspect of what I constantly. So a lot of times, just for reference, we're talking about social dynamics for neurodivergent learners. Sometimes that plays into the speech language pathologist role, right?
Sure.
Because they tend to assess for pragmatics, and pragmatics is, entering into those social situations and recognizing how to initiate conversations, maintain conversations, end conversations. And so, what I often see is that from an ableist or compliance or neurotypical standpoint, is that gets to approach is that, like, they're parallel playing, which means that they're playing next to others and having a good time. They need to be actually playing with their peers. Um, they are not saying hi or bye or hello. They're not making eye contact. They're not all these things, disregarding their disability and disregarding their autonomy when it comes to those social dynamics. And so, one of the things I always say, echoing what Lisa is saying, is I always say two things can be true. And in
Absolutely.
two things being true, it can be that I have exerted a significant amount of capacity at the beginning of this day. And so I just want to be over here and read my book with my headphones on during recess. At the same time, I could also have times where I'm not exerting a whole lot of capacity and energy, or I have that stamina, so to speak, and capacity to engage socially with peers, but I don't know how.
Right.
And so, excuse me, one of the things I often point at when I see goals on the IEP around those social pieces, and that is, I do bring it back to that self-advocacy of like, what does the learner want? What do they want to do? There's many times where I've seen learners that will go and stand near a peer because they don't know how to say, can you come play this with me? Can we play a game? Can we do this? But that comes from observing them, from learning them and recognizing, okay, what's going on there, right? And sometimes peers are receptive and recognizing, and they're like, hey, do you want to play with us? Or I've heard kids, because I've worked in settings with kids, I've heard them just go like, yeah, we include Destiny because Destiny just stands by herself and we want her to be included. So we go get Destiny and include her, right? So, but that lets you know too, like, okay, they do want to be included. They don't always know how. And so part of the neuroaffirming piece is supporting them in natural situations and opportunities where they want to be included, in advocating for that inclusion, learning to have discussions, right? About like, no, I actually don't want to play hide and seek. I'd like to play tag.
Right.
But I'd like to play it with you. We played this last time. Can we play this? So like that negotiating and problem solving. Right. But another thing that comes to mind for me too, when you're talking about that social aspect and honoring autonomy and advocacy, goes to parents. I have come across where parents are pushing sometimes for that socialization that the learner is self-advocating against at the time because of the need to reserve their energy due to their capacity level. And so I just said a whole lot of like, Destiny, what the fuck are you talking about? For some parents that like, because I mean, my families that are listening to me, they know exactly what I'm talking about because we've had this conversation and I speak like that. But if you're listening to me, what I'm referring to is I've seen situations where I'm in IEP meetings or 504 meetings, and the school team, and we're talking about when they're not coming from ill intent. So I know some parents going to be like, they're just making that up. They're just saying this bullshit, right? So I have seen where the school team is pointing out, like, they prefer to do individual work. Like, they don't like group work, or they prefer to be separate from peers in the setting. Parent has echoed to me privately that learner has possibly expressed that as well in certain dynamics, certain subjects, right? Sure. But then there's a concern about friendships and peer interactions. And so parents like, I want to see XYZ. School team has attempted XYZ. Learner's not responsive. And so part of the self-advocacy goes to us as parents. And I did a post about this a while ago. And this situation is like really what it stemmed from, is us as parents also honoring their advocacy when they might not have the capacity to access the thing you want them to access. And in particular, this is a PDA learner. This PDA learner is like, I'm just trying to make it through the fucking day. And so to do that, I need a little less socialization in my academic setting, right? And that's a hard thing for parents because it's like, I want my kid to have friends. I want them to have these interactions. And I get that, but you also have to be willing to honor and validate their advocacy and give them the space, and set up those natural opportunities and give them the opportunity to engage when they have the capacity.
Yeah, I think that, so important you bring that up. I think that what potentially is happening in some of those situations for parents where they're feeling almost a sense of urgency, right? Mm-hmm. And so because fear has entered the room, really honoring that advocacy unintentionally starts to happen, right? And I think that in part where that fear comes from, because I think there's a grain of truth in lots of things, and more than one thing, as you've already said, can be true at the same time, is that when a learner is isolated, whether that's self-selected, I need a minute, give me some breathing room here, folks, or not, as kids get older, this really can kind of diverge into one of two directions, and actually both can occur at the same time, which is that the learner can become invisible, right? So those attempts that were happening earlier on of including the learner in play stop happening. Because one of the things that I see happen often is if the play shifts or it looks different or doesn't feel right to the neurodivergent or autistic learner, and they're not able, ready, etc., to say, hey, can we do something a little bit different? Or even communicate like, oh, hey, thanks so much. I'm going to go head over to the whatever. But the tendency is to just walk away. That's really confusing for the peer group that was like, hey, wait a second, where'd Lisa go? Right? And so at some point, there's an assumption that like, Lisa doesn't want to play with us. There potentially is like, Lisa's kind of weird, right? Which I know sounds shitty and able and awful, but like, is something that kids will think. Like, Lisa was here and Lisa was gone, and right? There's a potential that they feel rejected by Lisa. And when people feel rejected and they take it personally, they're like, well, fuck you. Like, I'm going to reject you back. Right? So Lisa can become more and more and more isolated. And at some point, Lisa can become invisible, and the peers forget to like humanize Lisa's experience as this might be overwhelming for her, and we need to continue to try to include. The other sort of path is that Lisa becomes a target. Right? Lisa is perceived in some ways as a threat. She's weird. I don't understand her. She rejects me. She pisses me off. And like shit rolls downhill, and it makes me feel like the bigger person to go after her. And both things can happen at the same time. And I think we as the adults need to be honest about that as we're thinking about the whole child, of like trying to find that balance of honoring their advocacy, honoring who they are as a human being, honoring their sensory needs, honoring their communication, all of it. And what are some of the ways that we can sort of help teach? You know, one thing that kind of comes to mind is like perspective taking or social engagement or communication style in a neutral way, not socially thinking expected, unexpected, you make people feel like shit, kind of gross ableist way, but like human beings exist differently, right? Like multiple things can be true. So that a learner can develop some sense of agency and listen to their own intuition. Oh, this person likes small talk. I learned about that in speech group, that some people like that. And I learned I'm a person that doesn't like that.
I hate small talk.
Right. Oh, my husband, my daughter, it's like, why would you ever? Whereas I will talk to anyone and everyone and love it. Fills my cup. And my son is exactly the same way. It's the ADHD. We're like, new person, new information, dopamine hit. It's good times. And my son, or excuse me, my daughter, my husband are like, why would I talk to somebody I don't know?
See, and that's the thing. I will talk to, because my sister and my dad have pointed this out. Like my sister and my dad have pointed out, me and my mom will talk to people we don't know. But I will talk about specific things. It'll be like something of interest that I'm like,
sure,
I would talk about that, but I don't like small talk.
Yeah.
I will stand there and look at you and be confused.
Right. No, that is how my daughter and my husband are. And they're like, why? Why did you just tell that person whatever you just told them? Why are you continuing to ask them questions? Because the conversation is ping-ponging, right? From subject to subject,
Right.
right? And they're both just like, do you need a cork? What are you doing? But for the autistic or neurodivergent human to go, oh, this is how Lisa engages in conversation. Like, that doesn't work for me. How do I exit out of this situation? Maybe Lisa's not my person, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, one of the things that was so beautiful, kind of going back to the conversation with Rachel Dorsey and VTC and Meg, I think it's Farrell is her last name,
It
Farrell,
is. Mm-hmm.
um, was Rachel and V were like describing their friend groups,
Mm-hmm.
and they're all neurodivergent.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was like, oh yeah, it's just like, oh, Lisa totally loves such and such. And so like when she talks about such and such, she gets super like happy flappy and like stimmy, and it's so wonderful and fun because we love to see Lisa like super excited about whatever it is. And
Mm-hmm.
even if it's not my jam, like I totally resonate with the like deep dive passion, excitement around whatever your thing is, right? So like I may
Mm-hmm.
not be, say, interested in anime, but watching you be excited about it and like, you
Mm-hmm.
know, chat about it and share all the things you love, like makes me so happy to see you happy. And like, whereas like a neurotypical person might be like, what's going on? That person isn't quote unquote reading the room, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in a circle of other autistic humans, even if the point of interest or passion isn't shared,
Mm-hmm.
the style is shared.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's safety in that.
100%. And I think what you're speaking to too is that a part of being neuroaffirming, right, is honoring everyone. It's meeting everyone where they're at, but also honoring how they come into the space. And what we often do is we often teach neurodivergent individuals how to be neurotypical.
Right.
We
Yeah.
teach them how to be socially acceptable. We teach them how to comply with social norms. We don't teach neurotypical individuals how to support neurodivergent individuals. We
Right.
don't teach them how to recognize stimming as something that can be necessary or that can be due to stress or can be due to excitement. We don't teach them to understand that their autistic peer may be very literal or that their ADHD peer might jump from topic to topic or interrupt them, not in a way of not wanting to hear what they're saying, but because I had this thought, and if I don't say it, I'm going to lose it. Um, this is something Lisa and I battle every day.
I'm like the story of my life. I'm like, and my mom's the same way. She's like, let me spit it out because I'm gonna forget.
And it's like, but that's the thing is that when you talked about like the perspective taking, and one of the things that I often have to mention to my families, because they will come to me a lot of times because of the neuroaffirming aspect. And the first thing they'll say is like, they mention social skills. I'm immediately disgusted. I'm like, absolutely not. And I'm always like, pause. Yes, we don't want to do neurotypical social skills. We don't want to maintain eye contact. That's fucking disgusting. We don't want them to ignore what they're feeling, their energy level, and disregard that for compliance to be socially acceptable. That's also fucking disgusting. Um, what we do want, though, is for them to have the autonomy and the agency to enter into social situations. And to do that, sometimes they have to learn in a natural way that feels comfortable by their choice, right? How to do that. So, for example, I want to play basketball with these guys, but I don't know how to say I want to play basketball with these guys, right? And it's like them telling you, like you just asking, which is something we also don't do, is we don't ask, like, what do you want to do? I want to play basketball. I want to ask them to play Uno with me. want them to come over here and play dinosaurs with me. I want to see if they would be interested in joining track with me. Right? Like knowing that, you can then go, okay, so let's talk through why that feels difficult for you. What happens when you get, your palm sweating? What are you feeling? Are you anxious? Are you nervous? Is it you're afraid to ask because other people are around? Have you maybe asked them something before and they said no? Like, that's part of that advocacy piece, is that you're giving them the agency to decide these are the situations I want to be in. I myself have never liked group work. Never liked it. Don't ever enjoy it. I half the time feel like my group members aren't doing it correctly. They're not doing it on the invisible timetable I've created in my head. And it doesn't look the way that I have decided it should look. Right. And it's like, but yet I had to do group work. And so it's like, if you were trying to teach me how to like do group work in a socially acceptable way, like, I'm gonna tell you right now, I don't care, because you're already saying I have to do it, so I have to do it. So I don't care about, like, it just needs to get done so we can get it over with, because I don't want to do it. But like asking my friends about spending time together and hanging out, I did not do that. I was that kid that got invited. I was quiet. And so they were like, she seems cool because she seems chill because she's quiet. And so I'm going to just invite her. And then I had a social faux pas where I started working and I had practice, and because I was doing sports and I couldn't go. And then it seemed like I didn't want to go, because didn't have enough capacity or energy, but they didn't know that. And I didn't know that, because this is like 20 plus years ago. And they just stopped asking. And I was sad, but I still could eat lunch with them, but they weren't asking me outside of school to do things, right? So I got picked up into the friend group of my sports team because we were always together because we had practice. You see what I mean? Like, right. I was that neurodivergent individual that didn't know they were neurodivergent, but like fell into friendships. And then in college, really gravitated towards people like me. And then we all find out later, like, we're neurodivergent. So, that self-advocacy, when we talk about perspective taking, when we talk about collaborative problem solving, and when we talk about initiating and maintaining and ending conversations, we are talking about giving them the opportunity to discuss what feels right for them, giving them scenarios and situations that are realistic to them so that they translate. Because a lot of other things that we do, and then I'll hop off my soapbox and hand it back over to Lisa, is that we force neurodivergent individuals, we give them these blanket scenarios that have nothing to do with them, that don't apply to them. And then when they don't implement the skill, quote unquote, that you feel you taught them, you don't recognize it's because we're Black or white thinkers. And that's not the scenario that happened, versus taking an actual scenario where I saw you crying at recess when your friend Lisa walked away. And then you tell me it's because I wanted Lisa to do jump rope with me and Lisa wanted to go play tag. And I didn't know how to tell her that I wanted her to do this and then we could go do that. Or I didn't think that was an option. And so you walk me through that. And now I tackle that next time.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, I think one of the biggest highlights of what you just said is, again, centering the learner and their experience and what's important to them and what is happening for them, instead of kind of an arbitrary, these are the rules. But I've heard autistic adults speak to that having some level of quote unquote social skills taught to them was helpful, because social scenarios can be confusing. Like, why the hell are you doing whatever it is that you're doing, right? Or like, my daughter will say to me, like, especially in high school, I mean, not that this doesn't happen at younger ages as well, but like in high school, and I do think it's interest-based driven or activity-based driven, like folks kind of silo off a little bit. Right. So you have folks that like do theater or play basketball or in the choir or whatever it may be. Right. And so you see these like circles, and there usually is like a group that has social status, right? The quote unquote cool kids. And like for the love of money, like my daughter's like, why? Like, because there's a lot of, for lack of a better way of putting it, there's a lot of masking that happens in those groups, right? Because you're so worried about the social pressures of like, I'm supposed to act a certain way. And so for her autistic brain, it was like a bunch of inauthenticity and trying to kind of like one up each other, and they weren't kind.
Right.
And she was like, I don't get it. Like, I literally don't get, like, why the fuck would anybody want to be in that friend circle? Like, you can't be who you are, and they're mean.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, you know, it's really funny because I think probably similar to you in high school, like I got along fairly well with everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely had friends that I was closer to, but like I was home a lot on Fridays and Saturday nights. Like I didn't have like necessarily like a core circle where I was invited. I
Mm-hmm.
had some friends, and it's not that I didn't spend some time with them, but I was sick a lot in high school. I missed a lot of my junior and senior year for just random, like I had mono and missed a bunch of school, and I had some random, like, can't pronounce it, viral infection that acts like a bacterial infection. So it took them months of keep putting me on antibiotics that weren't working for them to be like, oh, you have whatever. I can't even remember what the hell it was called. It
And
was
now we played the game. We figured it out.
right, whatever it was. Like I just missed a bunch of school. It was really stupid. And so I felt like I got kind of forgotten because, like, you know, by that point, a lot of people had driver's license, you know, whatever. I don't even know what I was gonna say, but like, I really feel like I started to find like a circle
Mm-hmm.
in college.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really funny because as I sort of reflect on my own life and certainly currently, the people who are in my life that I am closest to are all neurodivergent.
Mm-hmm.
Like by and large, that's who I feel safest with.
Because that's who you can be yourself with. And I think again, that and really again tying it back, that's who you can self-advocate with. Like it's not, I mean, again, I've seen my son and his best friend do their video call, and it's just so funny because at one point I've heard both of them kind of just basically be like, all right, well, that's it. That's all I've had to talk about. Okay. All right. Bye. And they have like a handshake and they like do their handshake virtually. And then they get off the call and it's like no ill will. And I remember even my best friend, one of my best friends, I was on the phone with her and she had said like, yeah, I'm just like work was rough. Like I'm burnt out. And like, so I don't really have the capacity for a whole lot of conversation, but we had to talk about something because she was like a visit was coming up and she was coming to visit me and my husband and the boys. And she said something. And so then I started talking and then she's like sighs and I'm like, oh yeah, I was like, why didn't you stop me? And she was like, no, because like, I have problems like stopping when somebody, she was like, but I'm like, yeah, you did say at the beginning that you did not have like the capacity to be on the phone talking to people, but we had to like, I was like, okay, all right. Love you. Bye. She was like, love you. Bye. And we just got off the phone because
Right.
it's like there's no ill will there. There's no, it's just like I don't got it.
Right.
So I'm off and like the advocacy is accepted. So I think the way in which, wrapping up our two-parter, the way in which you honor self-advocacy with learners is like Lisa mentioned, one, is centering the learner. A lot of times when we go to teach, right, or support or skill build, it's what the adults want. It's what the adults see, what they observe. Yeah. And we don't inquire about the learner's mindset. We don't ask like, oh, like Miss Destiny noticed this at recess. Like, did that bother you? And they might be like, no, because I was done playing and I wanted to do something else, And so it's like we don't actually ask questions and inquire. And so we're not really centering them. We're giving our perception of what we think that socialization should look like. We're giving our perception of what we think that self advocacy should look like. The other side of centering it, centering the learner is, validating the self advocacy. So, and part of validating goes along with not personalizing. Right. Yeah. So going back to episode 1 or part 1, excuse me, of the self-advocacy recording, it's like, don't personalize the no. Don't personalize the language that might be disrespectful when they're dysregulated, right? And validate and then circle back, right? When they're regulated and in that space. And sometimes early on for my son, I know part of that circling back was me and that adult talking, right? Because I'm his trusted safe person, dad's his trusted safe person. So we're able to say, hey, buddy, like this occurred. And he's able to be like, hey, like this is what I was feeling and thinking. And then we're able to say collaboratively problem solve and then circle back to the school team and go, this is what he was actually thinking and perceiving of the situation. This is what could be helpful. How do we make that an appropriate solution? Because what I say is like an example I always give in meetings is that in our house, you can walk off if you're frustrated, irritated, we're having a conversation. You do that at school, it's eloping. It's disrespectful. It's all the things. So I always throw that example out and the school team often goes, yes, you're right. Like, I'm like, they can leave the room because they're upset. You know what I mean? How do we make that translate over into your setting where that form of self-advocacy is not considered a behavior issue or a disciplinary matter?
Really good point to bring up. The last thing I want to say, and I'm recognizing time, and Destiny and I, in between recording the last episode and this episode, because we're just doing it on the same day, we're brainstorming potential upcoming sessions, and one of them is really going to be around presuming competence and like, what does that look like? But I feel like these conversations, we haven't taken a deeper dive into what advocacy and social connection looks like for non-speakers.
Yes.
And that is something that we will definitely be diving into with the presuming competence conversation, because just because somebody is non-speaking does not mean that they don't desire social connection, have, passions and interests that they want to explore, right? All the things. And so I'm just going to leave us with a thought to marinate on until we come back together, that these conversations around advocacy and friendship are not limited to humans who have access to mouth words, vocal speech. And
100%.
This need to honor communication and recognize that desire for connection and community is just part of being a human being.
Absolutely. And I think even from individuals who do speak and have a lot of verbal language, I know that we take a lot of time to learn from non-speaking, minimally speaking, and unreliably speaking individuals. And so I definitely think in the neuroaffirming aspect, and I know Lisa and I both support individuals who are AAC users, we definitely will do an episode more diving from a neuroaffirming perspective on that, because, you shouldn't be controlling their AAC devices, withholding their AAC devices, limiting the buttons on their AAC device. When you talk about self-advocacy, all those pieces, they can press no 16 times. You need to figure out why. So, yeah. We definitely want to do that. So hopefully with part 1 and part 2 of self-advocacy, you've gotten a little better understanding of what neuroaffirming self-advocacy looks like, and the different ways to recognize when a learner could be self-advocating that doesn't look the way that you've traditionally been told it looks, as well as ways to really, again, center the learner, validate the learner, support the learner in their self-advocacy, while subsequently teaching them and supporting them with neuroaffirming ways to approach social situations.
Yeah, absolutely. Until next time.
Until next time. Thank you again for joining us here in the Affirming Village. We're your co-hosts, Dr. Destiny Huff and Lisa Baskin Wright, and we hope today's conversation leaves you feeling seen, supported, and better equipped to advocate for yourself or your learner. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this with someone else in the village. Until next time, keep advocating, keep affirming, and keep building the village we all deserve.